Στα σύγχρονα μητροπολιτικά πεδία, όπου η μοναξιά, η περιθωριοποίηση και η εξατομίκευση αποβάλλουν όλο και περισσότερο την έννοια της κοινότητας, πώς θα μπορούσαν να έχουν πραγματική προοπτική και πρακτικό περιεχόμενο οι ιδέες του ελευθεριακού κοινοτισμού και της απελευθέρωσης της πόλης.
Clearly, we cannot generalize from one city to another. Each city has its own history, its own political culture, its own physiological reality, and therefore, when we look at the need to build urban social movements, which ultimately will have an ecological and a democratic dimension, we have to choose what cities we want to work in. Most cities still, even under the pressure of urbanization, still have what are called sociologically neighborhoods. And it is in those neighborhoods where we have to find ourselves, and we have to work in those parts of the city that have their own distinct social and cultural characteristics. In going into those neighborhoods, like, if you will, urban guerrillas of a certain kind, we have to be able to identify what social, economic, and political issues are of concern to the people who live there. It could be transportation issues, that is to say, the public transportation network of the city doesn't properly serve that neighborhood. It could be housing issues, that is to say, the housing stock of those neighborhoods is not satisfactory and does not give proper housing as a right to the citizens of that neighborhood. It could be an environmental issues. For example, there could be toxic land in those neighborhoods. When they demolish certain buildings, we discover that the buildings that were there before and the buildings that were there before then left certain toxic residues in the soil. That could be an issue. It could be a part of the city that has exceptional air pollution, and therefore issues of public health become important to that neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So each neighborhood, one has to begin with a research project. One has to see who lives there, the economic and social classes that live there, the history of that neighborhood, and what are the main issues that concern the citizenry. And by the way to find that out, or the way to find out some of these answers to some of these questions, is by knocking on the doors of neighborhoods and carrying out a kind of questionnaire survey, which also allows you to know who lives there on a face-to-face basis. And that's important. Once all of this information is accumulated, and you and your comrades, you and your friends, your companions, also decide to live in neighborhood A, B, and C in different parts of the city, and you keep each other informed how your research is developing and what you're finding in terms of the morphology of the neighborhood, and I use this word morphology in a social, cultural, political, and economic sense. Once you get to know these neighborhoods, or the neighborhood that you're particularly concerned with, then you decide on what kind of action you would like to initiate. And depending upon what you decide to do, and this takes, by the way, a conviction and a certain amount of courage, because it's terra incognita for you, but this is the praxis of the theory. One of the problems about the libertarian left or the social ecologists or all of these people, I won't mention any names because I don't want to get into any unnecessary arguments at this point, is that a lot is being written, a lot is being philosophized and theorized about, but there isn't enough practice. There's not enough attempts to apply the ideas. So there's not enough of a history of praxis, which means, of course, theory to practice and practice to theory. And that's what needs to be done. So once you begin to work out what kind of social actions you want to undertake, then, of course, you get to know the people personally. And personal relations are very important in a neighborhood. People have to learn to like you, and people have to learn to trust you. And you have to be, you have to attract to your action group the kinds of people who are affable, the kinds of people who are charming and quote, nice, unquote. I mean, it's not everybody who has that kind of personality. And that's how you begin in the neighborhood. It's stone by stone by stone by stone. You create a conversational group. You invite people to your house, and they invite you to your house. You meet in local cafes. You meet in local grocery stores, in the supermarkets, various people. You find out what social groups, what cultural groups are in the neighborhood. And slowly, after a certain period of time, you begin to see the human elements that can be brought together to undertake a social action. So let me give you an example of my neighborhood, which is the neighborhood that I had the most experience with. In the late 1960s, a number of people around a community center saw that the neighborhood was being threatened by speculators, by developers who wanted to destroy a 6-block area and build high-rise apartment buildings for another class of people, a richer class of people. This was a poor neighborhood, although it was a historic neighborhood and a neighborhood filled with heritage buildings, very famous Greystone buildings from the late 19th century history of Montreal, and which were built for the bourgeoisie of the old city. But at a certain point, that bourgeoisie wanted to go even further away from the center of the city. So they abandoned those houses, and a lower class, in quotation mark, a lower class of people came in and lived in those neighborhoods. These speculators, these developers, wanted to destroy this building, this series of buildings, and to build a whole new city. They even had the pretensions of calling it the city of the 21st century. And so a small group of people, we were about, at the beginning, we were about 12 to 15 people. We got together and we said, well, we have to alert the neighborhood that there is a very important danger. Of course, the way in which you bring people together is to identify a common enemy. If you can identify a common enemy and articulate the nature of this enemy, and this enemy could be too many buses or too many trucks going through the street, or a developer or a speculator who wants to destroy the neighborhood to build up luxurious housing, or a factory nearby that pollutes the air, and so on and so forth. If you can identify one or two basic enemies, that is the way in which you can organize people. And so the 12 to 15 of us began to do exactly what I described earlier. We started to do a research project to find out who lives there, where do they come from, what is their thinking. We had public information meetings where we called them into the community center or in public parks and spoke to them about the problem, the threat, and we started petitions, we started information meetings, and inevitably we started demonstrations, and we did everything that had to be done to build an urban movement. And without repeating myself, this is the way in which we did two things. Because when you create a sense of movement, when you create a sense of solidarity in a neighborhood, you also deal with the question of alienation. In other words, people get to know each other. This is a very important cement that is absolutely essential in building a movement with a social and political perspective. There is a bonding that takes place. There is a sense of community that is created. People stop each other on the street and not only say, hello, how is the weather? But they say, well, what is the latest? What is the latest news about how the fight against the common enemy is going? So the whole relationships in such a neighborhood become, quote, politicized. They become political relations, social relations, cultural relations. They're not just personal relations. But all of that, of course, is built upon a foundation of personal relations where people trust each other. And it's very interesting that in the course of building such a group in a neighborhood, what people say is, Fotis is a nice guy. I like Fotis. He has a nice smile. You know, he's a very warm person. They don't say, you know, Dimitri is an anarchist and therefore we have to be careful. Or they don't say, you know, so-and-so has a broken tooth or he walks with a limp. You know, they look for other qualities in people. And how you are characterized in some abstract way becomes far less important than who you actually are. And so you get accepted by the community, and that, of course, creates community. I could go on to describe the chemistry of how you put together such a movement, but the eventual conclusion that you come to is that all of this work, which is like a spider putting together a cobweb with a great deal of patience, with a great deal of time, is that it takes time, okay? No movement in a neighborhood or in a city is possible if, I want to underline this, if you are not prepared to invest 20 years. If you're not prepared to invest at least 20 years of your life in building and constructing something that has a sound foundation, forget it. Do something else. Study astronomy or fly to the moon or do anything. But this kind of building in a society that is as complex and contradictory as our own, a society that is so corrupting in its material obsession, to be able to to pierce that kind of dominant culture of consumerism that is constantly exported by the American empire and consumed by the American empire, you will not be able to sink roots in any particular set of areas in order to build something higher. So you have to have a short-term, medium-term, and long-term perspective. And that's what we did in my city, based upon the experience in my neighborhood and other neighborhoods. And so to take it a step further, we not only built, and we failed, okay? In other words, I want to emphasize this, not to give you a dreamy perspective of the future. The first 10 years, we carried out a struggle, and there came a point where we did everything. We had demonstrations, we occupied buildings, we were arrested by the police, we were taken to jail, we had trials, we were found not guilty, but we failed. And then 2 years later, we had to start all over again. And this time, we didn't focus on housing, we focused on traffic. We put housing aside. And with the same kinds of people, we focused on traffic. And again, we had information meetings, demonstrations, and so on and so forth. And again, we started to build something that brought things together. We also created, this is very important, we created a coalition, you know, We brought in different people from the trade unions, from other community organizations, from other parts of the city. We brought them in and we said, we need your help. And the result was that 5 years after, we won. We won, and we established the biggest cooperative housing project in all of Canada, which is a federation of 22 small cooperative housing organizations, non-profit housing organizations, and which is based upon, as I said in the previous part, on a land trust where all the land is owned together, like a kind of urban Soviet, if you will. In other words, each of the 22 organizations own a certain amount of buildings for the 1,800 people who live there. There are 647 different buildings of different sizes, but the land is owned in common, and because the land is owned in common, there can be no buying and selling of buildings. You know, it is taken off the private capitalist market, and that's very significant. And once we did all that, and we completely renovated all of the buildings, new electric wiring, new plumbing, painting, and so on and so forth, the houses became new in every sense. Once we did that, the community continued to develop, and we said, well, now what can we do? What are the new challenges? What are the new important questions? And there is where in 1988-89 we said to ourselves, we have to look at the reality of the situation, is that our neighborhood is okay, and there are other neighborhoods in the East that have also succeeded to mobilize and to organize, but we are facing an ecological crisis. And what are we prepared to do in the face of this ecological crisis? And it is there in 1989, inspired by social ecology, inspired by the ideas of Murray Bookchin and libertarian municipalism, that we decided, and this was particularly important as concerns the city and libertarian municipalism, we decided to do the following. But before I tell you what we decided to do, I also have to tell you that, because earlier we talked about the FRAP, that in 1974, a political party was founded in Montreal to get rid of the authoritarian mayor who dominated the municipal scene entirely. And that political party was called the Montreal Citizens Movement. The Montreal Citizens Movement. It's very interesting that they use the word movement and not political party, because the political culture of Montreal was such that people were not so happy with parties, but wanted to do something more original than parties. And because it was called the Montreal Citizens Movement, and because it had an interesting program, and the interesting program, as far as the libertarians, the anarchists of Montreal were concerned, had two special dimensions. One was that this Montreal Citizens Movement, the MCM, undertook in its program to decentralize the central power of City Hall, of the Dimarchion, towards the neighborhoods. And the nature of decentralization was to have in each neighborhood decision-making neighborhood councils of citizen and elected people. And these neighborhood councils would have political and economic power to deal with the problems of the neighborhood. Well, that's a very radical program in any country, in any society. So that was in the program of the MCM. And the other thing that was of interest in the program of the MCM was they had a very radical program commitment to housing. A lot of social housing, a lot of cooperative housing. In other words, as you know, in a capitalist society, there are the following forms of housing. There's private housing. You know, you have money, you buy your own house or your own condominium. You have city housing. In other words, the city or the regional state owns various buildings, and they say, well, you can go and live in this state-owned building. Or there are cooperative forms of housing, which are owned by the collective, are owned by the cooperative, and democratically administered by the cooperative. So there are these three kinds of housing. And the MCM put a lot of importance on social housing, cooperative housing. So that attracted the people who were discussing and thinking about how to implement the basic ideas of social ecology and libertarian municipalism. So what we did in the 1970s is we moved into the MCM, the Anarchists of Montreal. And we helped to take the program even further to make it more radical. For instance, the Congress of the MCM adopted the radical idea that the whole public transportation system of the city of Montreal would be free. People would not pay the way Fanny and I just paid to get onto the metro, the Athens metro. People would just walk in and walk out. And we also proposed ways in which this free public transportation system would be financed, very concrete measures. And we even had a demonstration of 10,000 people in front of City Hall in 1975, demanding free transportation. So it was not just an idea in a program somewhere on a bookshelf, but it was actually an idea that was popular in the minds of people in this city. And eventually, to make a long story short, but it's a very interesting story and should be studied not only by us but by others, this political organization, which became a political party, the MCM, in 1986, won the elections, the city elections. And no sooner were they about to win the elections, and they won the elections in November 1986, that they abandoned the principle of decentralization of power. They said, we can't do it now, we'll do it later. Well, I mean, we became, of course, extremely angry. And by that time, you see, the anarchist influence in the MCM had become much wider, so that there were people who were not anarchists, but were very sympathetic to those kinds of ideas, were extremely angry, betrayed, very frustrated. And by 1987, 88, people started to leave the MCM and to find out, try to discuss how to work at the city level in a different way, and so on and so forth. It's a very interesting history that I urge you to look at very carefully. Murray Bookchin looked at it very, very carefully, and he was going back and forth with various people from the Institute of Social Ecology up to Montreal on a regular basis, and we were talking to each other on the telephone, always comparing ideas. But by 1989, we decided to found our own political organization that was going to stand for social ecology and libertarian municipalism. And we founded a political party called Ecology Montreal. And we contested 2 elections. We did not succeed. We failed. And the conclusion was that there was not enough space enough elasticity in the political culture of Montreal to allow another political party, another political movement to the left of the Montreal Citizens Movement. So we abandoned that road, and what we decided to do instead is to open up a very important center on social ecology, which was the Montreal Urban Ecology Center, which was established 14 years ago by myself and some colleagues, comrades, and friends. And this Urban Ecology Center, which is to be found at the heart of this neighborhood that I was telling you about, which has established this cooperative neighborhood. I mean, it's interesting that this center, which is a building of 3 floors, a beautiful building, where 12 to 15 people work every day to do various projects, urban ecology projects, is to be found in the heart of this neighborhood, this cooperative housing neighborhood. I mean, it's not an accident that it happened that way. And so we founded the Urban Ecology Center, and what we managed to do with the Urban Ecology Center is to have 2 priorities. And this is the slogan of the Urban Ecology. The slogan of the Urban Ecology Center and the philosophy of the Urban Ecology Center was towards an ecological and democratic city, which means that you cannot have an ecological city without it being profoundly democratic, and you cannot have a profoundly democratic city without it being an ecological city. Those 2 things go together, which is the heart of social ecology and libertarian municipalism. And what we managed to do over these 10 years, the first 10 years, is to influence the whole environmental movement, not only in Montreal, but across Canada. And how did we influence them? Because before we founded the Urban Ecology Center, the environmentalists were interested in saving rivers, they were interested in saving forests, they were interested in saving whales, and so on and so forth. But they knew very little about the city being the principal parasite on the environment. The principal source of cancer is the city on nature, on the environment. As we know now, more than ever, the city consumes all the benefits of nature around it and exports garbage, noise pollution, air pollution. It's a net exporter of crap and a net importer of the benefits of nature. So this whole disequilibrium between an ecosystem and urban civilization, urban living, has to be completely rethought and reestablished. Otherwise, we're in a very, very serious situation. And the Urban Ecology Center, through its educational program, and by educational program I mean small seminars, workshops, and big conferences, big, medium, small events, we slowly managed to educate the environmental movement and the public consciousness of our city in its various neighborhoods, not simply to be concerned about rivers, forests, whales, and so on and so forth, as important as those issues are, but to be concerned about the problems of the city, which is transportation, retrofitting of buildings, public health, housing, all of the recycling of materials, the reusing of materials, and so on and so forth, new energy sources, whether it's solar energy, wind energy, all of these issues We brought them into the city, and we began to think of the new city. And we began to also experiment with proposing democratic ideas. What we did was we experimented with various forms of participatory democracy. In other words, going back to the philosophy, the most important part of what the new left of the 1960s articulated. How do you bring together people in the neighborhoods, not just our neighborhood, but other neighborhoods, to discuss and to propose ideas on how you change your neighborhood and your city, politically, economically, socially, culturally, as well as ecologically. Now, how did we start that? In 2000, I decided to go, encouraged by various people, to go to the second World Urban Forum in Porto Alegre. And there, I experienced something very interesting. Before that, I attended many international conferences with the peace movement, with various new left activities, and so on and so forth. It's a whole story. But this was the first large meeting, large forum that I went to, which had the following very impressive approach. First, I opened up the program when I arrived in Porto Alegre, which is a city of the same size as Montreal in the southern part of Brazil, and has a kind of similar infrastructure, industrial infrastructure. In many ways, it is a similar city. First of all, I opened up the program, and for the first time, I saw a program that related local questions, local issues, with regional questions, regional issues, and international issues and international questions, and back again. In other words, the local, the regional, and the international all were brought together, and every workshop, every round table, every discussion tried to relate the local with the global and the global with the local. This was the first conference I ever attended where there was a conscious effort not to abstract the local, not to abstract away the global, but to see the interconnection between all of that. So that in the program, you saw concrete manifestations, concrete workshops and seminars and roundtables on housing, on transportation, on pollution, on recycling, on all the very concrete problems of everyday life in a large urban area or a medium-sized urban area. And then we also saw the relationship of these questions, these very concrete questions, with the consequences at another level, at an international level. In other words, if the city of Athens doesn't know where to put its recycled material, like some of the European cities don't, they export it to Africa, and they bury it in some African country, the waste that comes out of these cities. Well, then the question of what you do with your recycling program in Athens becomes an international issue, and you look at the consequences of that in the outskirts of Dakar and Senegal, if that's where it's going. And so it becomes, those kinds of questions quickly become regional and international issues. And to see the sense of interaction and solidarity in the World Social Forum was very instructive for me. But also what was very important for me to see is how the discussions were conducted in the course of the forum. For instance, there were no plenary sessions where you voted for this resolution or for that resolution or for this declaration or that declaration. The genius of the World Social Forum was that it permitted horizontal relationships, what we call networking. It permitted me to get to know you and to see how we can work together in your city or in your region and my city in my region, and to keep in contact with each other by telephone, by the internet, by email, and so on and so forth, and how to work together towards getting political influence and to find solutions to problems. So it was very horizontal, therefore very libertarian, and still is. And so it was not your regular Congress where you say, I vote for this and I don't vote for that. So that was removed. There were not decision-making forums. And I would urge you, by the way, to look at the charter of the World Social Forum. And in Black Rose Books, we have published the best book on the World Social Forum that explains the whole methodology of bringing people together to discuss and to undertake common actions. And so when I returned to my city, I said, well, what we should do here is a social forum, but for the city. And that's what we did. In 2001, we organized the first social forum, and we called it the Montreal Citizens Summit. A summit is where people get together and either discuss things or decide things. And it started with 250 people. And a year ago, after 5 summits, we had over 1,000 people, over 350 workshops and seminars and roundtables. A big mobilization of people took place. See, but it took all that time to develop it, over 1,000 people. And in organizing these summits, in organizing this kind of social forum in Montreal, we became a political force in the city. And we became a political force that the Demarchio, the city hall, had to take us into account because we represented a lot of opinion. We had a lot of people behind us. We had a lot of people interested in ecological issues and advancing ecological ideas, but we also had a lot of people interested in radical democratic ideas and how to implement them. And in 2002, the city organized a summit of its own because they wanted to make sure that we were not the only political force in the city, probably. I mean, there were many reasons behind their city summit. But our summits were open to everybody. Anybody in the city could come to our citizen summit. But the city summit organized by the city was very top-down. And they said, well, you can come and you can come, but you cannot come and you cannot come. So it was very selective. Nevertheless, we managed to be present in this city summit and their city summit. And in that summit, we proposed some of the ideas that came out of the democratic ideas that came out of the second summit social forum that we organized. One of the radical ideas that we proposed was that it's very good for there to be the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948 by the General Assembly of the United Nations and signed by all sorts of countries. It is a moral document. You know, Greece has signed it, Canada has signed it, all sorts of countries have signed it, but there's no legal obligation for the Greek state to respect all of the human rights found in the declaration. It's all very good for various countries to have human rights declarations. Canada has a human rights declaration in addition. the region that I live in, Quebec, also has its own Declaration of Human Rights. And each part is similar but different from the others. But we said, we the libertarian left, said, we are interested in the city. And therefore, we believe that the city has to have its own charter of rights and responsibilities. And that's what we proposed. And the idea was agreed to by the Dimarchio, by City Hall. And, surprise, surprise, the mayor of Montreal invited Dimitri Roussopoulos to be the head, the responsible person for the creation of this charter. And we worked on various drafts of this charter for 2.5 years. And finally, we came to an agreement, to a consensus with this charter, which recognizes the whole concept of urban citizenship. This is very important. In other words, it is not enough for us to be Canadians. It is not enough for us to be Quebecers. Now, for the first time, we are also citizens of a city. We're also Montrealers. And as Montrealers, we have specific rights and responsibilities. And in this charter, the city of Montreal admits very clearly, more than any other city in North America, that it has responsibilities towards you in the areas of housing, democracy, environment, economic and social rights, cultural rights, environmental rights, and so on and so forth. It says in one clearly written document what its obligations are towards us, the citizens. Okay? And what is significant is that this Charter of Rights is applicable to everybody. In other words, you don't have to be a Canadian citizen to have these rights recognized. You could come from Thessaloniki and rent an apartment in Montreal and say, well, I have these rights even though I'm not a Canadian citizen. So this is very important. And even if you are a person who lives in the street, you still have these rights in Montreal. This is a legal document now. It's a legal document. I emphasize that. And because it is a legal document, if your democratic right is not respected by the city, you can contest it. You can go to the office of the ombudsman and say, I am not getting the right vis-a-vis housing that is declared in the Montreal Charter of Rights. And I'm making a complaint. And the office of the ombudsman is responsible for finding a solution to your complaint. So the citizen becomes a stakeholder in the political process of the city and begins identifying more and more with his or her city, his or her neighborhood. This development of urban and municipal consciousness is in my view, important in terms of recognizing the importance of cities in our daily life and the daily problems of our political existence. This document now, called the Montreal Charter, is getting international recognition. So that, for example, UNESCO has taken the Montreal Charter and has made publicity about it in various parts of the world. And this is also very important. UNESCO has a program, a specific program called Le droit à la ville, the right to the city. The right to the city is a very important political and philosophical idea that comes from the writings of the famous left-wing French sociologist called Henri Lefebvre, which, by the way, your magazine should pay some attention to. He has written some very important stuff on the city. And UNESCO has recognized it. Another UN agency called UN Habitat has recognized it as being important. And now there is beginning the circulation of another document that is complementary with our charter called the World Charter of Urban Rights for Citizens. This is people in a number of cities throughout the world that are collaborating together to create this World Charter of citizen rights in the city. The result of all of this, by the way, at the international level, and given the evolution of the global economy, an evolution that is largely determined by some 50 or 60 major cities on the planet. You know, what is happening in the area of economics is that nations become less and less significant in the world economy. And what is driving the world economy are these big cities. And of these 50 and 60 cities, you have the global cities, which are real concentrations of finance capital and major corporations, the 400 big corporations that dominate the world economy, so that the urban concentrations, if you want to call them cities or not, the urban what Bookchin called the conurbations, these great concentrations of political and economic and cultural power, called these global cities, that are driving the global economy. These are now slowly, what is happening is that the ground is slowly being prepared for the United Nations to recognize the place and importance of cities in the world picture. The United Nations was founded in 1948 as a United Nations. Okay, nations, 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 the nation state. But now the things have evolved to such an extent, economically and politically, that these cities are playing such an important role that the United Nations has to recognize them on the world stage. How that is going to be done remains to be seen. So that, for example, before coming to Athens, I was at the 5th World Urban Forum in Rio de Janeiro, where some 18,000 people from all over the planet were concentrated to discuss all of the questions that I've just mentioned that affect cities in the third world, in the first world, all over the planet. So here is a United Nations agency, UN Habitat, and again, I urge you to look at their website to see exactly what was discussed during the 5th World Urban Forum and the preceding World Urban Forums to determine what has been discussed in terms of urban planning, metropolitan planning, and so on and so forth. And to see the growing importance of cities. So therefore, when a city adopts a citizen charter of rights and responsibilities as a democratic tool, as a tool for democratizing the political culture, it is not unimportant. It is important. And Article 16H of this Montreal Charter of Rights and Responsibilities, and pay attention to this, gives the citizens of Montreal the right, not the privilege, the right to demand a public consultation on virtually any issue, any question. Okay, so that, for example, in this neighborhood, you have a problem, and the city council ignores it, the politicians ignored it. You as citizens can begin, if you were in Montreal, you can begin a process of going around to your neighbors saying, look, we have a problem. Here it is. Would you support, by signing this petition, a public consultation, an assembly of citizens who will legally discuss this problem with a view of saying we want this and this and this as a solution. And if you get X number of signatures on this petition, you take it to City Hall and you say, we want a public consultation. Now, in most cities of the world, okay, when citizens come to the politicians and say, we want a public consultation, the politician will say, we'll think about it. We'll take it under advisement. We may do it, we may not do it. In Montreal, they don't have a choice. They have to do it. They have to do it. They have to have the public assembly. They have to listen to the people. They have to hear the recommendations. And they have to respond to a social and political phenomena in their midst. There is no choice. That means, concretely, that this Montreal Charter has taken power away from the politicians. Because you know as well as I do that when politicians are elected, they think that they have the illusion that they have been appointed by the gods. You elected us, we will decide everything. And they forget about the people. In Montreal, you cannot do that. The people still, and very significantly, have the power to do certain kinds of things. And that comes from this Montreal Charter. And that important democratic tool does not exist anywhere else at the city level, either in Europe or in North America. I have to say that in Europe, there is founded around the city of Barcelona, because you know, Europe, you know as well as I do, has also gone from the nations down to the regions. So the regions within the European Union are playing a very important role. And within the regions, there's a growing recognition that cities also have a very important role to play. And therefore, there is a kind of decentralization and deconcentration of power from the national capitals to regional areas and regional cities. I mean, it's even happening in France, for Christ's sake. And France, as we know, was one of the most centralized countries in history. So something is happening out there, which we have to pay attention to in terms of the emergence of cities. And what I'm saying is that from the Urban Ecology Center in Montreal, we have advanced a number of radical democratic ideas which have been adopted and which we, the people, have to implement. Because even though they are legal documents, it is not in the interests of the politicians necessarily to publicize them or to give them great publicity or to, I mean, it's like the UN, the declaration, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you know. They adopted it, but they don't necessarily, not many citizens know about it. So we have to make it known. We have to take it into our neighborhoods. We have to implement it. We have to make people aware that they can use these democratic tools to advance these things. And so what I'm doing for you is giving you a certain perspective, a certain idea of how the social ecological idea the libertarian municipalist idea have contributed to create a political culture in Montreal that has a great deal of potential. I'm not saying that the city is Utopia. I'm not saying that we've invented the wheel. I'm not saying that it's the heart of the world revolution. I'm just saying to you that concretely, on the ground, I can say in all honesty that this city is the laboratory of social ecology. In other words, we have taken theory and put it into practice in various concrete ways, and I've just given you a small series of examples of how this has been done. And this has taken 25 years, and it's still going on to develop this whole development. Now, I've talked about neighborhoods, I've talked about cities. But in closing my remarks about cities, I want to remind you of something that has happened. 2003, 7 years ago. What happened? The majority of humanity now lives in cities. There's a whole evolution of urbanization. This has dramatic consequences, irreversible and dramatic consequences for the world economy and any future world political order. That means that when we do certain things in Montreal, we do it also with people that we know in Vancouver, in Toronto, in Ottawa, that is to say other Canadian cities, and through the World Social Forum, because the World Social Forum pays attention to cities, through the World Social Forum, we're also working with people in other cities and in other countries. We have a very important Quebec Social Forum. We've had 2 editions of the Quebec Social Forum. The Americans are having a big social forum in Detroit in June of 2010. They had a very important social forum in Atlanta, Georgia, in the south of the United States, where there were 10,000 people who came last year. And now there is in the process of organizing a social forum with the Mexicans, the Americans, and the Canadians for all of North America. So people are being brought together in debate and in discussion. What is the best strategy? What is the best way to move forward in order to force both capital and the state into another mode, to dismantle it, to take them apart, to challenge them, to control them, to destroy them, whatever emerges out of all of these considerations. And that, I think, is extremely promising and extremely important. And if we could do something like that to develop this kind of consciousness in Greece, because people always, well, when they talk about democracy, for good or for ill, they always talk about the Greeks. But of course, you are one of the most undemocratic societies around. You have a very powerful central state. If it wasn't for Europe, you would have not had any decentralization or regionalization of state power in this country. And so I know you're at the beginning stages of some very important work, but I think everybody throughout all these cities look upon what has taken place in Greece and what could take place in Greece as extremely important and very hopeful. So you are not alone in wanting to do important things for your society. There's a lot of empathy and there's a lot of interest. Let me conclude by saying what we're doing now. I described how the Urban Ecology Center was established, why it was established. I described very briefly some of its accomplishments. And I want to give you a very clear indication that its influence and the influence of this neighborhood, this very large neighborhood of almost 2,000 people that we saved and we completely changed, played a role in the evolution of the city, because similar developments took place in the western part of the city and similar developments took place in the eastern part of the city and also in the southern part of the city. So it's not simply an isolated example. It has percolated throughout the city, and it has also influenced what has happened in other cities. But that's a whole separate story and would take several hours to describe. But the Urban Ecology Center is a center which has advanced these ideas, and most successfully through the social forums that it has organized in Montreal. But now comes the question of what happens beyond the city of Montreal, because Montreal is a city on an island called Montreal, and on the island there are many other cities. And around the island of Montreal, there are other cities. So there is the Montreal metropolitan area, the greater Montreal area, within which there are 3 million people, okay, around 3 million people. So what we have decided to do is to form an institute. It's a little bit like the Institute of Social Ecology, but it's an institute that is concentrated on the city and all the problems and all the challenges of the city. And it's called the Institute of Political Alternatives of Montreal, IPAM, I-P-A-M. This is an institute based upon research, scientific work, organizing public events, publications. It has about 10, 12 young people who are in urban planning, architecture, local economic development, a whole range of issues that are studying the city and proposing alternative policies on how to plan and think out the whole regional development of an urban area, and to develop relationships with the people, the citizens in the other cities, so that you have political action, but it is also action based upon solid policy development, solid research and intellectual and political preparation. So it's not enough, what I'm saying, is to have educational activities, an educational center. It's not enough to have a social and political center. It is also important to bring together the intellectual muscle, the intellectual force to be able to give all of these ideas, all of these initiatives, the necessary power to make the maximum influence on the popular consciousness and, of course, on the political and economic forces that are out there. So what have we done in summary? We worked from theory to practice and created a new form of praxis. And now we're taking that praxis and we're going back also to theoretical and research considerations and to see how we can help in improving the quality of life in our city and our metropolitan area and in other cities with which we have comrades and various contexts to work with. And so to come back to this country, what I would urge you to consider is not only to have a center where you do educational work and action, but also to think of creating an institute where you bring people together in a serious way to discuss things very concretely, as well as do intellectual work to complete the relationship between theory and practice.
Αν ήθελε να το παίξει ο δικηγόρος του διαβόλου, θα μπορούσα να πω ότι ζητήματα όπως αυτά τα οποία μας αναφέρατε για την χάρτα των δικαιωμάτων του πολίτη, του Μόντρελ κτλ. Θα μπορούσε να πει κάποιος ότι εντάσσονται και σε και στη λογική ενός είδους πολιτικού φιλελευθερισμού. Πηγαίνοντας το παραπέρα, θα ήθελα να πω ότι εμείς ως αναρχικοί, ως ελευθεριακοί, πιστεύουμε ότι ο πολιτικός μετασχηματισμός μιας κοινωνίας θα πρέπει να συνοδεύεται και από τον οικονομικό μετασχηματισμό, προς μια κατεύθυνση του εξισωτισμού. Θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω το εξής. Εάν υπάρχει ανάλογος προβληματισμός στα πλαίσια του κέντρου αυτού και αν εκτός από το κέντρο που υπήρχε και τη δουλειά που έγινε, που απέδωσε τη χάρτα των δικαιωμάτων, εάν εκτός από τα democratic tools που αναπτύχθηκαν υπήρξε κάποιο σκεπτικό και για κάποια άλλα tools, κάποιες άλλες μεθόδους οι οποίες θα εξασφάλιζαν κάποιο είδους economic democratic tools. Δηλαδή, θέλω να πω με λίγα λόγια ότι είναι φυσικά σημαντικό, πολύ σημαντικό, να δεσμεύεται μία πόλη και να είναι αναγκασμένη ώστε να εξασφαλίζει κάποια δικαιώματα ακόμα και στους άστεγους. Το θέμα είναι όμως ότι τι γίνεται ώστε να εξασφαλιστεί οικονομικά αυτό το εγχείρημα. Δηλαδή, μπορεί ένας άστεγος να έχει δικαίωμα, να το εξασφαλίζεται από την πόλη το δικαίωμα, αλλά εάν για παράδειγμα χρειάζονται οικονομικοί πόροι, τους οποίους δεν μπορεί να έχει ένας άστεγος στον ίδιο βαθμό που έχει ένας αστός κάτοικος του Μόντρελ, εκεί τι γίνεται? Υπήρξαν κάποιες σκέψεις προς αυτή την κατεύθυνση?
Υπήρχαν πολλές. Now, let me give you some examples. I tried to identify certain very important daily questions that our daily life is based upon. The first one is housing. Okay? Housing is followed by food, followed by clothing, followed by employment, a job. These are 4 or 5 fundamental realities that our daily life is based on. The first struggle that I undertook, as I said earlier, is to make sure that the neighborhood in which I lived, these hundreds of people, all of them moderate income, low income people, you know, we're not talking about university professors here, we're talking about ordinary working people, that their housing, these 1,800 people had secure housing, okay? Now that is an economic, not only a political and social right, that is an economic right. Because when you are a member of a co-op, a cooperative, a housing cooperative, the rule is that you never pay more than 25% of your income towards your membership and your rent. Now you try to figure out where you live and tell me what percentage of what you earn goes towards your rent. Okay? So that is a fundamental economic right. And if, for some reason, in these 23 co-ops that I told you about, if for some reason you lose your job, you lose your employment, and you have difficulties consequently of paying your rent. In the co-ops, there is a solidarity fund which financially helps you to pay your economic obligations in the co-op. Okay? So you are secure from the point of view of housing. Nobody can throw you out on the street and say, look, you lost your job, you have to leave. On the contrary. This simple economic and political right, and by political right I mean you attend the General Assembly of your cooperative, you vote for what your rent is going to be, you vote who becomes a member of your co-op or not, you vote who can become who should be expelled from your co-op or not. I mean, all of these are democratic principles that are part of the co-op, that are part of what are called the Rochdale principles, which are the principles, the founding principles of the cooperative movement in England in the 19th century. All of this gives you and me a sense of security in our society and in our neighborhood, which cannot be taken for granted. Because a lot of the insecurity of people, a lot of fear of people against becoming politically active, let alone becoming radicals or anything else, is, you know, am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be, can I afford to pay the rent of my house? Can I pay the mortgage of my house, and so on and so forth. So housing, I cannot emphasize that enough. Housing is a very important democratic right. And I try to explain to you that that was the first democratic and economic right that was established in this large neighborhood that I worked with and I worked in all of these years. So I know about economic rights and I know about economic democracy, because it's not only enough to have economic rights, you have to have democratic rights. And these economic rights and economic democracy, I think, are fundamental to constructive anarchism. Constructive anarchism. Because you know as well as I do that the anarchists who, especially of a certain generation, who are very active in protesting and being against this and against that, and being beaten up by the police and arrested and so on and so forth, who are on the avant-garde of protesting against injustice here and there, do not always give sufficient attention to building the pillars of a movement, of an ongoing movement, which can be called a libertarian movement because it's based upon democratic rights and economic rights and economic democracy. So that's number one. Number two, if you read the constitutions of Greece, and 95% of the constitutions of nations throughout the world, you will find nothing about economic and social rights. Okay? The state never wants to acknowledge in its constitutional documents that it has economic responsibilities towards its citizens. It recognizes that it can have political responsibilities towards its citizens. You know, the right to election and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. But economic rights, no. And the reason why the state says that they don't want to recognize economic rights is because they say, well, if the people demand economic democracy here, there, and everywhere, where are we going to get the money to pay for all this stuff? That is their justification. In the Charter of Rights, the Montreal Charter of Rights and Responsibilities, it is the only charter in Canada. There's a Canadian charter, there's a Quebec charter, which I refer to, but it is the only charter in Canada that recognizes economic and social rights. So that in the Charter, it says citizens have a right to proper housing. It's not a privilege, it is a right. And since the local state recognizes that it's a right, you have the right to demand that right. You have power over the political authority to say, this is what we want. It says that the water supply in the city is a public service and cannot be privatized. Many cities throughout the world have had serious battles between citizens and their right to have free, quality, good water to drink, to wash, to cook, etc., etc. So this is a very fundamental social and economic right. So what I'm saying to you is, without going into great deal details, we have given a great deal of attention to economic rights. That doesn't mean that more does not have to be done. But we're getting there, because for the first time during our 4th Citizen Summit and the last one, the 5th Citizen Summit, the whole question of economic democracy was discussed amongst the hundreds of people who came to the summits. And the discussion took various forms. For instance, there is a movement in Quebec called the social economy. In other words, there is the state economy, there is the private economy, but there is now a social economy. And this social economy consists of various enterprises, small, medium, and large enterprises, that work with different democratic principles. It is not exactly workers' control. It is not autogestion in the pure sense of the word, but it is very much in that direction. And now there is a whole phenomena where this social economy form of economic development is spreading in other parts of Canada. And is when I was in Brazil a few weeks ago, one of the major discussions that took place in the Rio Social Forum, because, as I said earlier, I went to the World Urban Forum organized by the UN Habitat, but the Rio Left organized a social forum also. And in that social forum, where I and others spoke, we discussed the social economy. So I don't know whether you people have any knowledge about the social economy, but it is an important development. We have to be critical about it. We have to be careful about it, because a lot of public money goes into supporting the social economy. It doesn't come from the private sector. It doesn't come from heaven. It comes from the public sector. And the reason why the public sector is interested in supporting social economy enterprises is because there is a critical attitude towards state enterprises and public enterprises, and correctly so. So all this to say is that, and I've given you a few examples, that economic democracy and economic rights are extremely important in our thinking. And by the way, one of the reasons why in the 4th Citizen Summit and the 5th Citizen Summit we got the participation of the unions, and we have 3 major unions in Montreal and in Quebec, and one of them, the CSN, has a libertarian tendency, and it's a big union, it's not a small union. They supported the Citizen Summit with money and with support and people coming to it. One of the reasons why the unions have become interested in what we do is because we emphasize economic rights and economic democracy.
Ο Δεκέμβρης του 2008 αποτέλεσε για την ελληνική επικράτεια μία στιγμή κατά την οποία οι εξεγερμένοι σε μεγάλες πόλεις αλλά μέχρι και σε κεφαλοχώρια έδωσαν το παρόν τους συγκρουόμενοι δυναμικά με τις δυνάμεις καταστολής. Η εξέγερση αυτή αποτέλεσε μία σπίθα πάνω στην οποία θέργεψε ένα διεθνές κίνημα αλληλεγγύης στους εξεγερμένους της ελληνικής επικράτειας, αναγκάζοντας για παράδειγμα το ελληνικό κράτος να κλείσει σε όλη την Ευρώπη τις πρεσβείες της. Πώς εξέλαβαν οι βορειοαμερικανικές κοινωνίες αυτή την μακρινή για αυτές εξέγερση και ποιες ήταν οι σχετικές απόψεις που κυκλοφόρησαν στο ελευθεριακό κίνημα της Βόρειας Ευρώπης, της Βόρειας Αμερικής.
Look, obviously it was a very significant series of events. And obviously it shook this country down to its roots. The perception outside of Greece was that a solidarity movement had to be created. And that is very significant, that for once the focus of the solidarity action was on what was happening in the city and what was happening in the country generally. And all people that I know in North America were very concerned in getting all the information that could possibly come from the internet specifically and from the newspapers and the mass media as to what was happening and why it was happening. But if you permit me, in the end, people here were writing reports that were extremely optimistic as to what was going to be the ultimate outcome of this. I've read stuff that was written here that was circulated by ZNet in Boston, which is a very big communications network, where the murder of this young Alexis was going to lead to a social revolution, and that Greek society was going to be fundamentally transformed like that. I did not believe that that was even a hypothetical possibility. And why do people like me think that that was not likely to happen? Because even though here in Greece there are many interesting social organizations and social groups and social movements, there is nothing that I see that binds things together, that constitutes a sense of movement with any sense of common objectives. Okay? It's very scattered, it's very individualized, it's very fragmented. Now, this is not unique to Greece. The situation in Italy is the same thing. And as a matter of fact, the situation in Italy, if you speak to our Italian comrades, our anarchist comrades in Milano, in Rome, in Venice, etc., they are very, very pessimistic of what the situation in Italy is all about. So it's all very well to express anger and injustice as to what the state and the police did here in December of last year. But you have to look beyond that, and you have to look beyond the characterization of the anarchists here in Greece, a characterization which has been largely pejorative, largely insulting, largely negative by the establishment and all of its sympathizers, that these are a bunch of kids, children, who run around breaking windows of banks and so on and so forth. There are various ways in which a resistance movement can be built. I want to give you the example of what happened over 10 years ago, slightly more than 10 years ago, in Seattle. Okay? There is a very interesting film, by the way, that I recommend that you look at, called The Battle of Seattle. I don't know if it's circulated here. It's available in DVD. Look at it carefully, because it shows in a small way the brilliant organization of that demonstration against the meetings of the WTO, which resulted in the stopping of the WTO in the city of Seattle. I mean, the way the thing was all brought together. And so what I hope, and what is being discussed in other parts of North America when we look at the December events in Greece, is how this energy, this anger that exists here amongst the generation younger than yours and your generation, how this anger and this frustration can be developed beyond a movement, a spontaneous movement of protest and urban terrorism, you know, into something that is constructive, that builds movement, that builds institutions, and that builds a force in Greek society that can also take power, economic and political power, away from the center towards a broader distribution of that economic and political power amongst the people in the villages of Greece, in the regions of Greece, in the cities of Greece. That is what has to be done. So get on with it.
Η επόμενη ερώτηση έχει να κάνει με το πώς αυτοπροσδιορίζεστε σήμερα πολιτικά. Αν υπάρχει ένας πολιτικός αυτοπροσδιορισμός, τον οποίον...
Τι εννοείς?
Εάν υπάρχει ένας προσδιορισμός, δηλαδή ελευθεριακός, κοινωνικός οικολόγος, οτιδήποτε, που θεωρείτε ότι έχει για σας ένα νόημα στο να αυτοπροσδιορίζεστε ως τέτοιος. Μία πολιτική ταυτότητα, ας πούμε, να το πούμε έτσι, συγκεκριμένη.
Για μένα προσωπικά.
Ναι, για εσάς.
Ποιοι είναι η ταυτότητα?
Ναι. Σήμερα.
Look, in the 1960s, up until about 67, I considered myself a libertarian Marxist of the Frankfurt School variety. And I then discovered, through my readings and through meeting various people like Paul Goodman, George Bonello, Murray Bookchin, people like that, I began being interested in the anarchist tradition. And the main reason why I became interested in the anarchist tradition is because the anarchist tradition is the only tradition that is fundamentally anti-militarist. Because my first political involvement was in the anti-war movement, in the anti-military movement from the late 1950s into the 1960s. And it is anti-militarist because it wants to dismantle the military power of the state, and it wants to dismantle the military power of the military and of the police. The others on the left, be they Marxists or socialists or social democrats, they continue to believe that the state has to play a role of enforcement, of policing, of armies, of armaments, and all the rest of it. I mean, in various degrees, but it's all still over there. Whereas the anarchists want to remove all that. So by the late 1960s, I began identifying myself as an anarchist. That was 50 years ago. I still identify myself as an anarchist. I could tell you what kind of an anarchist I am, but I am still an anarchist. And people in Montreal, they say, oh, well, he's an anarchist. But I like him anyways, or I don't like him. Because one of the wonderful things about being an anarchist is that there are people who don't like you too. But for example, I work very closely with the mayor of Montreal. He knows I'm an anarchist. It doesn't bother him because there is the concrete praxis that I was telling you about. And behind what all of us have done, because it's not simply my accomplishment, there are many people who would have those kinds of libertarian ideas. I may be able to express them in a particular way, but they're ideas that are part of the political culture. Is that sufficient identity to you?
Clear enough.
It's not on my passport, you know, Dimitri Roussopoulos, anarchist, but that's the way I call myself.
Αποτελείται εκδότη των Black Rose Books. Πώς βλέπετε στην εποχή πλέον του διαδικτύου, του ίντερνετ, να κινείται το αναρχικό βιβλίο, αλλά και γενικότερα ο αναρχικός ελευθεριακός έντυπος λόγος?
Well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, in the 40 years that Black Rose Books has been in existence, we will be celebrating our 40th year this spring, June. We have published over 500 titles on a whole variety of issues, all based upon a radical critique, radical alternatives, many of them being anarchist classics, but also an area that particularly interests me, and that is contemporary anarchist analysis today, not Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin. We've published him too, but today. So we've published almost all of the books of Murray Bookchin. We've published over 15 books of Noam Chomsky. We've published almost 20 books by George Woodcock, and so on, all these people. And many writers who have written on the subject of anarchism, historically and in terms of contemporary analysis. But now we arrive at a new epoch. The epoch where the bookstore, especially the independent bookstore, are being closed down. And everybody goes to the internet bookstores, of which there are many. Amazon is one of the best known ones, but there are Barnes & Noble. There are many, many different kinds of bookstores. And they go there and they look at what they want. The trouble is that they can't pick it up and smell it and touch it, but they can look at it and they can see whether they're interested in the subject matter. And they pay, as you know, by a credit card, and it's delivered to their house. They don't even have to get out of their bed. And there is now a way which they can also look at the inside of the book. Through Google search, they can look at the table of contents, see what the book is about. They can read 1 or 2 chapters and see whether that's the kind of book that they want. In other words, all of this is accessible to them. A lot of the Black Rose books are available on Google search. We are building at Black Rose Books a new website. And the ultimate objective of this website is to put all of our books, present and past and in the future, in what is called the public domain, so that anybody in the world can have access to them. They don't have to buy the paper copy. What you have to understand about Black Rose Books is that it's not a project that has developed entirely by itself. It is part of the capitalist book market. In other words, we have big distributors in Canada and the United States, in England, in Australia, etc. These are professional, profit-making organizations that sell our books all over the place. And the ones that we have now are interested in putting all of our books on a technology which is called e-books. I don't know if that is, you know about that. And there are essentially three e-book distributors. There is Kindle, which is Amazon-driven. There is the Sony Reader, and there is the iPod Reader, which is going to come out pretty soon. So we're going to have to decide, and we probably will decide, to put more and more of our books on the e-book network, so that, again, anybody in the world can have the piece of technology, and they could go down and read the book on their e-book screen. And this is the wave of the future. There is no way in which we are going to be able to see in 10, 15 years from now a bookstore down the street where you can go and get a Black Rose Books or any other book for that matter. So the whole reading approach is going to be something completely dramatic different. I will probably be dead by then, but at least the books will be available. And that is potentially a democratization of all of this information and all of this analysis. But again, like every one of these innovations, more and more people have to be told about them. In other words, because something is because a book is on e-book, it doesn't mean that a lot of people are going to read about it. They have to know about it in order to read about it. And that's where we come together. Okay, we have to let people know that from now on, you know, this magazine can be read on Kindle or on the internet. And it's important for us to get them to know that it's available there. That doesn't mean that this should not come out in paper, but rather than having 2,000 copies in paper, you will have 500 or 200, and you make sure that it's on the web, and that a maximum amount of people are knowing that it's on the web, and they can go and read it right there, and they can have discussions about the articles and so on and so forth. So that is an important development, and it's going to play more and more an important role. So like Seattle, the organization of the Seattle Action, and all of the organizations around the major demonstrations around important issues, the mobilization was all done through the internet. And I would ask you a question. The events of December, to what extent did the internet in Greece play in the mobilization of the protest? I don't know the answer to that. The question was, what are my current areas of interest? And I will be very precise about that. What I want to do, my priorities for the next little while, is to make sure that the initiatives that we have taken up until now continue on a solid basis, on a serious basis, well organized with the necessary economic and political resources. But for myself, personally, the work that I want to finish before I return to nature is to draw upon my experiences that you have interestingly recorded here in a kind of schematic way, all the things that I've tried to do. What I want to do is to be able to bring this together in the form of written material in a coherent way. And most particularly, I want to concentrate on the question of democracy. I think there is a lot of stupidity around the question of the democracy in ancient Greece. A lot of ignorance. I'm absolutely appalled of how little educated Greeks know about Greek democracy. The smartest people are all outside of Greece on this question. For example, the most important research that has been done on ancient Greek democracy is at the Polis Institute in Copenhagen. And there is one Danish scholar, Magnus Herman Hansen, who has written 3 extremely important books on how that democracy worked in practice, it daily worked, you know, how the Vuli worked, how the Ecclesia worked, how people voted, how they spoke, what education they needed, and so on, down to the greatest detail. And these are based upon, you know, a lot of recent archaeological studies in the last 15, 20 years. But the Greeks don't know about this. It's not taught in your schools and universities, and even the political Greeks on the left, including the libertarian Greeks, hardly know anything about it. This has to be corrected. But this has to be corrected not only for the Greeks, but for everybody. You know, every time, for example, I speak about democracy at a public lecture, they say, well, what about the slaves? Or what about the status of women? You know, this constantly comes out the same thing. And I say to them, explain to me how an assembly of 20,000 male citizens met 6 times a year and made decisions on a whole variety of subjects. What was the comportement? How do these people behave? How did they vote? How did they speak? How was it that an assembly could not make a decision if there was not a quorum? You know what the word quorum means? A minimum number, a minimum democratic number of people, which was 6,000 people in the Pnyx. They had to get together to make a vote legal. Now, tell me how you get together 6,000 people, let alone 10 or 15 or 20, and you get them to behave in such a way that they can make a decision. I mean, so these are the questions that I throw back at an audience when they say to me, yes, but there were only males and there were no women, and there were, you know, it was a society based on slavery. So what I'm trying to get at is that the whole concept of radical democracy has to be really thought out very, very carefully and brought into its contemporary setting. And of course, for me, the contemporary setting is the city, the neighborhood, the city. How do you decentralize power from the nation to the cities? For example, one of the things that I find very fascinating is the Brazilian Constitution. I don't know if you've known the Brazilian Constitution, but I urge you to study it. The Brazilian Constitution was designed by the Brazilians in exile during the Brazilian dictatorship, and they wrote much of it in exile, and they were mostly in exile in Paris and in Lisbon. And one of the most incredible social revolutions in the 20th century, the Revolution of the Flowers, 1974, and we have published an excellent book on the Portuguese Revolution, was an extremely libertarian revolution. And it argued very much for the decentralization of power, economic and political power, throughout that little country called Lisbon. Well, the Brazilian left took that and created a constitution which has in it a special clause, a special section, which acknowledges, as very few other constitutions in the world acknowledges, that the cities are the engines, are the centers of Brazilian society, of Brazilian economic and political responsibility and power, and therefore there is a great decentralization of power within Brazil. The result is that a city like Porto Alegre or Belo Horizonte, which introduced 16 to 18 years ago the whole concept of participatory budgets, and I hope you would write about the participatory budget in your journal, whereby hundreds and thousands of people get together and decide on the economic priorities of their city. Up to 18 to 20% of the city budget is decided democratically by the people in the city. Can you imagine that happening here in Thessaloniki or in Patras? And so there is a level of participation in Brazilian cities in economic matters, because we're talking here about cash, which is very, very important. And in studying democracy, as we said earlier, it's not only political democracy that we're also interested in economic democracy, in social democracy, in cultural democracy. And that's what I'm working on now. And I would like to come here more often and think, discuss, and find a place in which these things can be discussed even more. So that's part of my agenda. The other part that concerns me is the state or the status or the condition of the anarchist movement, which is, again, not in the best condition. It's very fragmented, and there's a lot of useful things that are happening in it, but one of the reasons why Murray Bookchin, in the last part of his life, distanced himself from anarchism is because anarchism of the 20th century did not renew itself enough, did not take new directions enough. Now, I was involved in the 1980s in organizing, you may have heard about it, we published a book about it in French, English, Spanish, and French, and English. I was involved in the organization in 1984 of the famous Venice Convenio, and I was part of the planning committee, and we did all the preparations. And we were hoping that, 500 people would come, and we would have a serious set of meetings and celebration and eating and drinking and all, everything that we do and we do very well. And that as a result of 1984, a renewal would take place with new directions, new ideas, and so on and so forth. And what happened was, and we worked very hard, by the way, in the planning committee, in the International Planning Committee, to discourage or not to encourage the classical anarchists to come. Because we didn't want the old debates to take place, who shot the first shot in Barcelona in May of 1939. And what happened was that not 500 people came, but over 2,000. In a little city like Venice, we were overwhelmed. We had busloads of German punk anarchists coming into their bus with their blue hair and their orange faces. So the whole thing went out of control, so to speak. It took a whole different shape. But the end result was that it was a great festival, but there was no continuity. And as a matter of fact, I was one of the only ones who said, well, what are we going to do after the event? How do you stick together? And the Italian comrades and the Swiss comrades said, well, whatever happens, happens. They didn't want to get engaged in the organizational stuff. Well, that was 1984. Now, for me, amongst the most serious anarchists anywhere in the world are my good comrades in Milano. They put out beautiful magazines. Libertaria is one of them. Rivista Anarchica is another one. They have their newspaper Umanità Nova. They have Centro Studi Libertari Gipinelli. I mean, they're just wonderful people, excellent people, serious people intellectually. They're amongst my best comrades. And last year, I decided to go to Milano after many years, and I wanted to say to them, listen, the Convegno in 1984 was a very difficult thing to organize, and they did most of the organizing, you know, the Italian comrades. I mean, food, I mean, can you imagine bringing tons of food and wine by the gondolas into Venice to feed all of those people? So I went to Milano and I sat down and I spoke to them. And I said, we need to have another 1984. We need it now. And we need to organize it, and we need to bring serious people together to talk about a new anarchism. And I propose this idea to you, and we should work on it. And it should be in Barcelona this time. And they said, oh, Dimitri, too big a dream, too big, impossible to do it. You know, we're too old, we're tired, we want to go to a Greek island and retire. Don't bother us with this kind of idea. But I think it's very important. That's number one. So anybody wants to talk about it, I'm willing to talk about it. That's number one. Number two is, I think, the most important terrain, the most important field for intelligent anarchists, serious anarchists to be active in, is the social forum, the World Social Forum, the European Social Forum, for you, the Europeans, and for us in North America, what I just talked about earlier, the Mexican, American, Canadian social forums that are going to come, and the various social forums. Because there we meet not anarchists who wear black from their head to their feet, but libertarians who think in their head in libertarian directions. And we have to talk to them. And we have to say, well, what can we do together? How can we work together? How can we do this and that and do it this way and that way and so on and so forth? When I go to the social forums, I find many, many, many people who are interested in doing things differently. And my responsibility as an activist is to network with them and work with them and say, have you read this? Have you thought about this? Have you discussed this? Have you discussed that? And so on and so forth. So we have to be in a larger terrain, in a larger space, and not simply in our little house or in our little group where we feel secure, you know, because we only talk to each other. We have to go out of the box, as they say, go into a larger space. And the World Social Forum is a very important space. The World Social Forum, my friends, represents the biggest movement in terms of numbers. Please understand this. The biggest movement in terms of numbers in the history of our civilization. Thousands and thousands all over the world are involved in this movement. And it is completely wrong for anarchists to be makria, you know, away from it, because it's not this and it's not that. And I could give you historical examples where anarchists have played very important roles in the anti-war movement, the anti-militarism movement, the anti-poverty movements, and many different kinds of movements, because they chose to work with other people and to develop ideas along with that kind of work. So this is what I want to do personally. This is what I want to encourage other people to do politically with the anarchist movement, but also more broadly. It's a big agenda, and I hope we can do it together.